We often look to the past to understand ourselves. Tonight we turn our attention to the year 1864 and the solemn story of Thomas Briggs. It's a case that reminds us that behind historical records are real people whose lives were irrevocably changed by the events that transpired. This is their story, as best as it can be told. The Industrial Revolution had irrevocably reshaped the British landscape. By the mid-19th century, London was the beating heart of a global empire, a sprawling metropolis connected by an ever-expanding network of iron rails. The railway was the symbol of modernity, a marvel of speed and efficiency that promised to shrink distances and bring people closer together. For the Victorians, train travel was a new and exciting facet of daily life, seen as a safe and civilized mode of transport. This perception, however, was about to be shattered. On the evening of Saturday, July 9, 1864, a 69-year-old banker named Thomas Briggs was making his way home. He was a man of considerable wealth and standing, the chief clerk at the firm of Roberts, Lubbock and Company. After a day in the city and a meal with his daughter and her husband, Mr. Briggs made his way to Fenchurch Street Station. He purchased a ticket for the 9:50 p.m. North London Railway service, a short journey that would take him to his home in Hackney. He settled into a first-class carriage, likely anticipating a quiet, uneventful trip. But as the train rattled through the darkening London suburbs, Thomas Briggs was unknowingly traveling toward a violent and tragic end. His journey that night would not end at his destination, but instead would mark the beginning of one of the most sensational criminal cases of the Victorian era.
As the 9:50 p.m. train from Fenchurch Street continued its route, it made its scheduled stops, with passengers embarking and disembarking as usual. But when the train pulled into Hackney Wick Station, two bank clerks, who had just boarded and were looking for seats, made a startling discovery. They opened the door to a first-class compartment, number 69, and were met with a scene of disarray and horror. The carriage cushions were soaked in blood, and more blood was spattered across the floor and the window. A walking stick, a leather bag, and a low-crowned hat were found inside, but the compartment was empty of any passenger. Alarmed, they immediately notified the guard. The train was held at the station as railway officials scrambled to understand what had happened. Their search for answers did not last long. Just a short while later, down the line between Bow and Hackney Wick stations, the driver of a train traveling in the opposite direction spotted something lying on the embankment beside the tracks. He stopped his train to investigate. There, gravely injured and unconscious, lay the missing passenger, Thomas Briggs. He was bleeding profusely from severe wounds to his head. It was clear he had been brutally attacked and then thrown from the moving train. The officials acted quickly, carrying the wounded man to a nearby tavern, the Mitford Castle, which served as a makeshift infirmary. A doctor was summoned, but the injuries were catastrophic. Thomas Briggs never regained consciousness. He succumbed to his wounds the following day, turning a shocking assault into a case of murder. The public's faith in the safety of railway travel had been violently derailed.
With the death of Thomas Briggs confirmed, what began as a railway incident became a full-scale murder investigation, led by Inspector Richard Tanner of Scotland Yard. The crime scene was not the dark embankment where Mr. Briggs was found, but the blood-stained carriage where the assault had taken place. The compartment offered up the first crucial pieces of a grim puzzle.
The victim's personal effects were present, including his leather bag and his walking stick. However, several valuable items were conspicuously missing. Mr. Briggs was known to carry a distinctive gold pocket watch and a long, heavy gold chain, neither of which were on his person or in the carriage. His elegant silver-rimmed spectacles were also gone. Robbery was the clear motive. The most significant piece of evidence left behind, however, did not belong to the victim. It was a black, low-crowned felt hat. It was not the top hat that Thomas Briggs had been wearing, which was found battered within the carriage. This second hat, investigators surmised, must belong to his killer. An examination of the hat revealed the maker's name, but the lining had been removed, a common practice to make a hat fit more comfortably. The police hoped this single item, a common accessory in Victorian London, could lead them to a suspect. Alongside the hat, another small but vital clue was discovered on the carriage floor, a single broken link from a gold chain. It was a tangible piece of the struggle that had occurred, a remnant of the violence that had cost Mr. Briggs his life. The investigation now had its first threads: a missing watch, a missing chain, and a hat that belonged to a killer. The investigation began to move outward from the confines of the railway carriage. The police focused their efforts on the two most promising leads: the hat and the missing gold chain. The hat was taken to its manufacturer, who confirmed it was of their make, but also noted that it was a popular style and they had sold many like it. However, they provided a list of retailers who stocked their products. Patiently, detectives began visiting each hatter on the list, showing them the hat and hoping someone would recognize it or a specific customization. It was a painstaking and often frustrating process, a search for a needle in the vast haystack of London's commerce. Simultaneously, word was put out to jewelers and pawnbrokers across the city, asking them to be on the lookout for a very specific gold watch and chain. The police circulated a detailed description of the items that had belonged to Thomas Briggs. This was another monumental task, given the sheer number of such establishments in the capital. The days following the murder were filled with this meticulous, ground-level police work, while the public grew more anxious, with newspapers dubbing the crime the railway murder. Investigators worked tirelessly behind the scenes. Their big break came on July 18th, more than a week after the crime. A jeweler and goldsmith in Cheapside named John Death came forward with a remarkable story. He told the police that a man with a foreign accent had recently come into his shop and exchanged a gold chain, matching the description of the one stolen from Mr. Briggs, for a new watch and a different chain. Mr. Death had the exchanged chain in his possession. The broken link found in the carriage was a perfect fit. The testimony of John Death, the Cheapside jeweler, was the breakthrough the investigation desperately needed. He provided a detailed description of the man who had traded the gold chain. He was a young man, a German, who had given his name as Müller. Crucially, Mr. Death had also sold this man a box for his new watch. The box bore the jeweler's name and address. The police now had a name, Müller. The next step was to find him. As it happened, a cab driver named Jonathan Matthews also came forward. He reported that on the night of the murder, he had taken a young German man to an address in Bow. He recalled his passenger giving the jeweler's box to a young lady. The address led police to the lodgings of a 24-year-old German tailor named Franz Müller. When they searched his room, they found a small box from John Death's jewelry shop. Inside was a new watch chain. They also discovered that Müller had recently had his hat altered, cutting it down to create a low-crowned style that precisely matched the hat found in the railway carriage. The pieces were falling into place with astonishing speed. The cab driver, Jonathan Matthews, was brought in and positively identified Franz Müller from a photograph as the man he had driven that night. Investigators learned that Müller had been living in London for several years working as a tailor. He was known to be in some financial difficulty. The evidence against him was mounting, creating a clear and damning picture. But when the police moved to arrest their prime suspect, they were met with a new and daunting challenge. Franz Müller was gone. He had already fled the country. The discovery that Franz Müller had vanished presented a major obstacle for the investigators. Inquiries quickly revealed that just 6 days after the murder, on July 15th, Müller had set sail from London aboard a vessel named the Victoria. His destination was New York City. In 1864, this would have typically been the end of the line for a police investigation. Once a suspect crossed the Atlantic, they were usually beyond the reach of British law. But technology was changing the world, and this case would pioneer its use in international law enforcement. Less than a decade earlier, the first successful transatlantic telegraph cable had been laid, connecting Europe and North America. It was an expensive and novel form of communication, but Inspector Tanner recognized its potential. Scotland Yard sent a telegraph message to the police in New York. The message was brief but effective. It contained a description of Franz Müller, the details of his crime, and the name of the ship he was on.
The telegraph had done its work. By the time Inspector Tanner and his witness arrived in New York, the local police department was fully briefed and prepared to act. All they could do now was wait for the arrival of the Victoria. The wait lasted for several weeks. Finally, on August 24, 1864, the ship carrying Franz Müller sailed into New York Harbor. As the passengers prepared to disembark, a contingent of New York City police officers, accompanied by Inspector Tanner, boarded the vessel. Müller was reportedly calm and collected as the officers approached him. He initially denied his identity, but quickly conceded when confronted by Tanner. A search of his belongings was immediately conducted. The officers went through his luggage, and there they found the ultimate piece of incriminating evidence, the gold pocket watch that had belonged to Thomas Briggs. To make the discovery even more damning, Müller was also in possession of the victim's hat, which he had seemingly kept as a trophy, or perhaps for practical use. The chain of evidence was now complete and unbroken. It stretched from the blood-stained carriage in London, across the Atlantic, and into the hands of a suspect who possessed the very items for which Thomas Briggs had been murdered. Franz Müller was arrested on the spot. The first transatlantic police pursuit ended in a resounding success. The next step was to bring the accused back to England to face justice, a process that would involve complex legal extradition proceedings between the two nations. The extradition of Franz Müller was secured, and he was returned to England under guard to stand trial for the murder of Thomas Briggs. The trial began at the Central Criminal Court, the Old Bailey, on October 27, 1864. It was a media sensation. Newspapers in both Britain and America had followed the chase across the Atlantic, and the public was enthralled by the story. The courtroom was packed each day with journalists, artists, and curious members of the public, all eager to see the man at the center of the world's most famous manhunt. The prosecution, led by the Solicitor General, laid out its case meticulously. They presented the powerful chain of circumstantial evidence that linked Müller to the crime. Witness after witness was called to the stand. The jeweler, John Death, identified Müller as the man who had exchanged the stolen chain. The cab driver, Jonathan Matthews, testified to driving Müller on the night of the murder. The hat maker confirmed the hat found in the carriage was of a type sold to Müller. Finally, the detectives from Scotland Yard and New York testified about the discovery of the victim's watch in Müller's possession upon his arrest. The prosecution, led by the Solicitor General, laid out its case meticulously. They presented the powerful chain of circumstantial evidence that linked Müller to the crime. Witness after witness was called to the stand. The jeweler, John Death, identified Müller as the man who had exchanged the stolen chain. The cab driver, Jonathan Matthews, testified to driving Müller on the night of the murder. The hat maker confirmed the hat found in the carriage was of a type sold to Müller. Finally, the detectives from Scotland Yard and New York testified about the discovery of the victim's watch in Müller's possession upon his arrest. The defense, led by a prominent lawyer, Dr. Hermann Karl Gottlieb, fought vigorously. They argued that the evidence was purely circumstantial and that the identification by the witnesses, particularly Matthews, was unreliable. They suggested that another man, who was known to be an associate of Müller, could have been the real killer, and that Müller was merely an unfortunate victim of circumstance, having bought the stolen items unknowingly. Despite these efforts, the weight of the evidence against Franz Müller was immense.
The trial lasted for 3 days. After the closing arguments from both the prosecution and the defense, the judge summed up the evidence for the jury. He carefully instructed them on the nature of circumstantial evidence, explaining that a chain of interconnected facts could be as compelling as the testimony of an eyewitness. The jury then retired to deliberate. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. The fate of Franz Müller and the final chapter of a case that had gripped 2 continents rested in their hands. They did not take long. After only 15 minutes, the jury filed back into the courtroom. The foreman stood and delivered the verdict. Guilty. A hush fell over the room as the judge donned the black cap, the traditional symbol of the death sentence. He pronounced that Franz Müller would be taken from the court and hanged by the neck until he was dead. Throughout the trial and sentencing, Müller had remained composed, maintaining his innocence. But with the verdict delivered, his composure seemed to crack. The public reaction was one of overwhelming approval. The railway murder had instilled a deep sense of fear and vulnerability, and the verdict was seen as a restoration of order and safety. Appeals were made on Müller's behalf, particularly from the German community in London, who felt he had been convicted on weak evidence and anti-foreigner prejudice. However, all appeals were denied. The date for the execution was set. On the morning of November 14, 1864, a vast crowd, estimated to be around 50,000 people, gathered outside the walls of Newgate Prison. Public executions were still a common, albeit grim, form of public spectacle. They came to witness the final moments of Franz Müller. At 8 a.m., Müller was led to the gallows. He was accompanied by a German-speaking Lutheran minister who had spent the final days with him. In the moments before the execution, the minister reportedly pleaded with Müller one last time to confess if he was guilty. Accounts from the time differ, but the most widely reported story is that as the hood was placed over his head, Müller turned to the minister and uttered his last words in German, "Ich habe es getan." I did it. With that quiet confession, the trapdoor opened, and the case of the first murder on a British railway came to its solemn conclusion. The story of Thomas Briggs and Franz Müller left a lasting mark on Victorian society. It highlighted the vulnerabilities of modern life and spurred calls for better security on trains, leading to the introduction of communication cords and the famous Müller's light, a lamp to illuminate carriages. The investigation itself was a landmark in policing, showcasing the power of meticulous detective work combined with groundbreaking technology like the Telegraph, setting a new precedent for international law enforcement. The case became a touchstone in the history of crime, a chilling reminder that progress and violence can often travel the same track. Thank you for spending this time with us. Reflecting on these past events is a way of remembering the individuals involved and the impact their stories had on their communities. If you have any thoughts on today's case, we invite you to share them respectfully in the comments below. We hope you will join us again for our next true crime case.